Okay, just by way of introduction, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a GP by background, so my interest really is in health. You'll just have to forgive that for those of you who are not from that background. I'm going to focus particularly on the things that determine children's social, emotional and cognitive well-being early in life. So that's really going to be the focus of my talk. It's going to be about largely preschool children and the things that make a difference for them in terms of their social, emotional, language, cognitive development, their well-being generally. And I'm interested in that as a GP because it is those things, social, emotional, cognitive, language development, which are the strongest determinants of health later in life. So the very strong predictor of how long you're going to live is how things were for you when you were wee. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk a bit about the way in which we can support parents of preschool children, particularly, and I'm really interested in the children under 3. So lots of my talk is going to focus on the work of health visitors. I'm going to start off with a physics lesson. Johannes Kepler, some of you may have heard of him, described the inverse square law a very long time ago in the 17th century. And he described it as follows: a specified physical quantity or intensity is inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the source of that physical quantity. And that means if you're twice as far away from a light bulb, you get a quarter of the amount of light. And if you're 3 times as far away, you get a 1/9 of the amount of light. That's where the physics lesson stops. And if you have the same view of physics as I did when I was at school, then you'll be quite pleased about that. So no more physics. So I'm going to move on to another chap with an interesting beard. This is Julian Tudor-Hart, who is one of my heroes. He was a general practitioner in the valleys of Wales, and quite an extraordinary man. He mentored 2 of my great clinical teachers, and he punned on the title The Inverse Square Law, and he coined the term the Inverse Care Law, which he described as follows: the availability of good medical care tends to vary inversely with the need for it in the population served. This operates more completely where medical care is most exposed to market forces and less so where such exposure is reduced. And he said that in 1971. And sadly, it's as true today as it was then. What he was actually describing was the phenomenon. He was particularly interested in blood pressure and stroke and heart attacks. And what he discovered was that the people who were most likely to have a stroke were the people who were least likely to have their blood pressure measured. And furthermore, even if they did have their blood pressure measured, they were less likely to have their blood pressure treated. And furthermore, if they had blood pressure which had been treated, they were less likely to have their blood pressure treated adequately. So that's the sort of archetype of the inverse care law, which is that the higher the risk you're at, the less care you get. And I'm interested in ways of trying to address that issue. And I think the time at which we are most likely to get our biggest bang for our buck is in early childhood. And Michael Marmot and others, in his fantastic report on health inequalities, started off being interested in adult health and concluded at the end of the report, which I would commend to all of you, that actually the strongest determinants of inequalities in health are rooted in very early childhood. So, this is our domain. I'll talk about a few examples. I could talk all day about inequalities in child health, but I've just got 3 examples here of the way that the inverse care law has worked in our child health services over the last few years. Until 2005, we had a very comprehensive system of child health checks. Remember those days? Some of you are old enough to remember before 2005. We had regular child development checks, and The children who were most disadvantaged were, of course, the children who were least likely to be brought along to their checks. And in fact, the 20% of children who did not come along to their 2-year check contained most of the likely problems that children were going to have. Okay? So that was one of the reasons why we turned against regular child health surveillance checks. As we'll see later, that wasn't the right thing to do. Perhaps we should instead have said, how can we get the other 20% into the system? But rather than doing that, we abandoned it. We published a paper, you'll be getting access to these slides, so any of you that are interested in the references, you don't have to write anything down, it's all going to be there. We published a paper a couple of years ago in Family Practice, where we looked at the determinants of people's use of health visiting and general practice services, and what we found was that more affluent families were the ones who were more likely to seek advice from health visitors and GPs. Big surprise? Not really, but that's the way it is. My great friend and colleague Helen Minnis, who many of you will know, child psychiatrist in Glasgow, who's been very interested in attachments and attachment disorders, but you're about to see a paper shortly appearing in print called Reactive Attachment Disorder in the General Population, Not Rare but Hard to Find. And the reason for that is that they were screening the population of children, and they tried to identify children with reactive attachment disorder, which is a particular pattern of behaviours associated with disrupted attachments and maltreatment. And what they found was that for every child they got into the study that didn't have reactive attachment disorder, they had to work about 20 times harder to get a child with reactive attachment disorder into the study. So getting access to the children who are most vulnerable psychologically in the population takes a lot more work than getting access to the others. And one could argue, in terms of child health screening, maybe you should ignore the 80% that do turn up and just concentrate on the 20% that don't. This is a map, which some of you may have seen if you've heard me speak before. I love these maps. This is a map of scores on the Strength and Difficulties questionnaire in Glasgow. The Strength and Difficulties questionnaire is a 25-item, very, very simple screening tool that you can use to come up with a score for child mental health problems, for want of a better word. It looks at emotional problems, conduct problems, hyperactivity and attention problems, and autism type problems, and you just add the score up, and you get a score which is up to 40, in fact. Now, if you score, you can either score 0, 1 or 2 for each item, and there are 20 items. So if you divide Glasgow, this is a map of Glasgow, it's divided into council wards. This is a deliberately political act, making this map. I was rather hoping that the councillors would be competing with each other for making things better for their children. It's not happened yet, but we live in hope. So this is the electoral wards in Glasgow, and we have Strength and Difficulties questionnaire scores now for 6 successive years for every child going into primary school from a local authority or a partnership nursery. Okay, so we've got about 80% of the population of Glasgow's children, and these are 5-year-olds, okay? And these are the average scores for the electoral wards. And you'll see these are the lowest scores, 3, they're the lightest colours. And there's a big surprise, the lowest scores are in Hill Head and Partick. Now those of you from Glasgow will know that, well, that's where I lived. And that's where my relatively affluent colleagues and intellectuals live in Glasgow, or a lot of them do. And you'll see here that the next bit areas up, these are the sort of south side areas, Baillieston, bits of Maryhill and Kelvin, and that they're scoring a bit better. And you'll see that the next layer up, sort of the swathe across the middle of the city, includes quite a lot of the East End. And Springburn is there as having scores which are twice as high on average as the scores in Hill Head. Okay? Springburn, I think, John, has got the highest crime rates in Glasgow. In fact, yeah? And in fact, we actually looked to see what the determinants of these scores were, and in fact, there was a very, very strong correlation between crime rates and children's, particularly boys' conduct scores. But that's a map, and that demonstrates that there are inequalities in child well-being, which are demonstrable as early as age 5. And they're quite marked, such that their scores are twice as high in one bit of Glasgow than they are in another. Deprivation and crime are important in determining these figures, but they're not the whole story. There are, when we corrected for deprivation and the individual nurseries that the children were in, because there's a tendency in some nurseries to score children higher than others. Some staff have sunnier dispositions than others, perhaps. When you correct for that, you'll see that the pattern changes a little bit. Now, the red areas here are worse than average, so we've corrected the scores for these demographic variables. And the green are better than average. Well, again, Hillhead's better than average. That's interesting, because obviously Hillhead's a much more affluent area than the areas in the East End. But even accounting for the affluence, Hillhead still seems to be doing rather well. And the East End of Glasgow generally doesn't do very well at all. The area there is red. So those areas are all doing worse in terms of children's well-being, even when you've corrected for affluence deprivation. And interestingly, and I've talked quite a bit about this, Govan seems to be doing quite well. Now, Govan, the population of Govan is just as poor and just as unemployed as the populations in the East End of Glasgow. But something about Govan seems to be a little bit better. It's got Sunny Govan radio, that may be part of it. There are other possible causes. I get a sense that there's maybe a bit more of a sense of community in Govan than there is in some areas of the East End. Less disconnection, less gang culture. Govan's not without its problems, but somehow or other it seems to be a better place to grow up in than the East End, in terms of social, emotional and cognitive well-being anyway. Okay, so those are some inequalities. Now, when you're 5, if you're... This is age 5, okay? These are the scores. Now, the different colours represent deprivation. Okay, so these are children that are least deprived in purple, and the children who are most deprived are yellow. Okay, so this is deprivation score for the area of residence. Now, what we see here is that if you're in the most affluent 5th of the Scottish population in Glasgow, then you're scoring just over 4 on the Strength and Difficulties questionnaire. And if you're in the most deprived 5th of the Scottish population living in Glasgow, then your score's a bit over 6. Okay? And that follows in a not linear, but there is a straightforward relationship according to the affluence of the area that you live and your social, emotional, cognitive well-being at age 5. Okay? Now here's the chilling bit. Between age, we followed up, we're just about to make this a much bigger exercise. This is just our earliest pilot data, and my colleague Louise Marriott did most of this work, I should acknowledge her. She linked the data at age 5, because not only are we collecting Strength and Difficulties questionnaire at age 5, we're also collecting, or the education services are also collecting Strength and Difficulties questionnaire scores at age 7, and also at age 10 as well. So we've been able to link the data at age 5 in the same children with their same scores when they're 7. Okay? Now, this is the scary bit. If you are living in the most affluent areas, your score goes down. And if you're living in the most deprived areas, your score goes up. Okay? That's in the first 3 years of primary school. That's between starting school and P3. So something happens at primary school that amplifies the pre-existing social differentials in social and emotional well-being. And we've been trying to drill down into whether there are school-related factors there, and there probably are. If you invite me back another time, I'll tell you what they are, but we're still looking at it. But there are school factors which seem to be playing into this. Okay, so what I'm arguing here is that there are differentials in child well-being. Those differentials are evident quite clearly at age 5. Actually, they're evident earlier, but less so. And they amplify by the time you start school. So children that start off school in a good shape are likely to end up in a good shape. Children that start off not so well are likely to get worse. Okay, so what can we do about it? And I'm moving here a little bit towards thinking about health visiting, thinking about parenting programs, thinking about parenting support programs. Okay, so there are different ways that we can think about this. How are we going to tackle this kind of inequality? Well, one way of doing it is universal services, and another way of doing it is targeted services. So something for everybody, or you can identify a group of people and offer them a service preferentially. And on the face of it, that latter targeted idea sounds like a good idea, because it sounds a bit fairer in terms of giving people who are struggling more of a help up. Or maybe we can have a bit of both. So we have a universal service which is used, the universal bit of it is used to identify the people in most need and to offer them most support. And that's really what health visiting now seems to be aspiring to do. I'll talk more about some of the good stuff with health visiting later. So just to summarise the evidence on universal parenting programs, actually they don't work. There's now quite good evidence from big quality trials. There's the trial in Melbourne from Melissa Wake's group, no effect shown for parenting programs delivered to everybody at age 2 in terms of child well-being and parental well-being. Marty and Manuel Eisner's group, big Zurich trial of triple P, didn't produce any effect at all. There is a study which is often suggested to be showing benefits, which is the big South Carolina triple P trial. Actually, if you look very carefully at the data, it didn't show any effect at all, although it's been heralded as being a great triumph for universal parenting programs. Actually, it didn't produce any effect. It didn't work in Glasgow either. As some of you will know, we have spent many millions of pounds on triple P in Glasgow, and actually, obviously I didn't make myself very popular by saying this, but the evidence is it didn't make any difference. These are the SDQ scores over the time that triple P was introduced in Glasgow. So this is starting in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. So triple P was introduced around about here into Glasgow, and we've got this data, or these data for every child going into primary school from a Glasgow nursery, and actually the scores didn't alter at all significantly over time. If anything, things got a little bit worse in terms of conduct. So I take this as saying that actually giving parenting programs to everybody is a waste of money. Happy to take questions on that. Okay, so this is from a paper that I wrote with a number of colleagues. We looked at the triple P data, and what we did was we looked to see whether there is a difference in effectiveness according to the baseline level of problems that families have. It's called a meta-regression, and this is what's called a bubble plot. And what we did was we looked at the variations in the score, the baseline scores in the children, and then we looked at the size of the effect. And to boil this down to the simplest level of finding, essentially what it shows is that when the child hasn't got very many problems, you don't get any improvement by giving parenting programs. Whereas when the child's got really big problems, then you do. It's not a bit of a no-brainer really, but actually that is the finding from actually rather a lot of randomised trials of triple P. Okay, well, targeted interventions, the story's slightly different. I would say that there is now very robust evidence that Incredible Years and probably the Family Nurse Partnership, although there are some questions about the Family Nurse Partnership in terms of what it was compared with and so on. But probably those two programs in particular have got absolutely cast iron evidence, or almost cast iron evidence for effectiveness. Okay? Now they're very, very highly targeted. The Incredible Years programme, although it's tried to expand itself a little bit beyond its evidence base, so to speak, by and large the Incredible Years programme targeted at children who are at risk of going on to develop serious conduct problems really does work, and there are 6 large-scale, well-conducted, independent randomised trials which demonstrate that. Family Nurse Partnership, there are fewer independent trials, but I think the evidence is pretty compelling. So targeted programmes, yeah, you can produce quite a big bang for your buck with those things. But here's the big question, this is what I want to focus on in the last bit of my talk, is it getting to the people who would benefit most from them? Well, when we abandoned child health surveillance in 2005, the Scottish Government guidance suggested that we should follow the reports, the report called Hull 4, which many of you will have heard of. That's the cover of the book, Health for All Children, written by 2 paediatricians. Actually a very good book, a very good read for anybody interested in child health, preventive child health stuff. And there's very little in it that you could disagree with, actually. But the main recommendations of Hall 4 was that we're wasting our time trying to do regular child health checks on everybody. What we should be doing is being more targeted. We should be identifying children who have got high levels of risk factors, and those children who are not being identified because of the high levels of risk factors will be picked up anyway because their parents will come along because they're worried. That's the idea. However, it doesn't work like that, and we've produced some quite strong empirical evidence that it doesn't work like that. First of all, parents don't always know that they need help. Well, that's obviously true in certain situations, like, for example, families where there's substantial neglect. I mean, the parents don't know they're neglecting their children. By and large, they don't anyway. We also identified that when we looked at language delay across the whole hundreds of children living in the west of Glasgow, what we found was that only 1/3 of the children who had really significant language delay identified by health visitors were getting any kind of help with it at all. Okay, so these are a bunch of children with really serious language delay, and the parents didn't know there was a problem. Okay? Also, we can't predict who's going to need help very well. We did a whole series of analyses looking at predictive factors, and right enough, deprivation is a predictive factor, and care and intensive care paediatric intensive care units is a predictive factor. But actually, put together, we're not very good at predicting which children are at risk, and that's in relation to language delay, for example. We found that even with all the risk factors put together, we were only able to identify about half the children who had problems. So there's a bit more to it than that statistically, but essentially we're not very good at predicting who's going to get into trouble. Charlotte Wright did a very beautiful paper based on the Starting Well project in Glasgow, where children were identified by health visitors. This was a programme of home visiting ranging from the middle of pregnancy till the children were 2, and the health visitors were asked to rate how at risk the child was at every one of those visits. And in fact, when you look at the children who at some point were identified in the highest risk group, the health visitors were only able to identify half of those children before the children were 1 year old. Okay, so what that says is that bad stuff happens. It may happen because, parents have split up. It may happen because an abusive person has moved into the household. It may happen because something's not right with the child's brain and it's not immediately apparent. But you can only identify children at risk by being there and seeing that they are. You can't just work it out before birth in particular. The Sure Start problem, well, you'll be familiar with this. I mean, Sure Start Children's Centres, great idea. They did a lot of good, and they have done a lot of good. But actually, children at the highest risk in the early Sure Start evaluation, those families did not use the Sure Start services. And that's a very important thing to remember. A friend of mine who works in a Sure Start centre down in England said, you can hardly get in the place with the 4x4s parked in the car park. Now the FMP problem. FMP, absolutely great. I'm a huge fan of David Olds, as I'm sure many of you are, but you can only get it if you're a teenage mother and it's your first child and you've booked on time in your first pregnancy. If you haven't booked on time, you can't have it. If you've moved into the area, you can't have it. If you're not a teenage mum, you can't have it. And if it's your second child, you can't have it. So it's great for the people that can have it, but those people are a tiny proportion of the people who've got problems. So the FMP is a great thing in itself, but it's not a solution to inequity in delivery of parenting support. The triple P problem in Glasgow, we identified the previous page has got a web address where we showed the SDQ results, if you were interested in our final report. In relation to triple P, health visitors clearly identified the children who were most likely to need parenting support. So all the right children were referred into triple P programs. But what we found with triple P was that actually all the families with the biggest problems, or a large proportion of the families with the biggest problems, dropped out or didn't turn up in the first place. Okay, so there we had a slightly different situation where children at risk were identified, but for whatever reason, the intervention wasn't suited for the children at highest risk, if you see what I mean. And in fact, there's a German paper by Halveg and Heinrichs and colleagues which showed that actually lone parents got worse when they had triple P than they started off, whereas families who were in couples did better. Okay, so just to conclude, there are big variations in the need for parenting support. Economic factors, deprivation, is a big part of it, but it is not the whole picture. Now, you can use the evidence we have about deprivation, for example, in Glasgow, you could use that for planning your resource allocation. So you could put twice as many health visitors per head of population in Springburn as you do in Hill Head. There's nothing wrong with that, and actually that is what Scottish Government is doing at the moment. So that's the way you can use those kind of data is to work out where you put your resources, but it's not the whole story. Providing good parenting programs, very important to do that, but it's not enough. It doesn't guarantee that the right people are going to use them. So we need to find a way to identify needs and offer support in proportions of that. And I think this is what health visiting, a large part of health visiting, should be all about. And it's done within the context of a continuing, trusting relationship, which a recent government policy, until very recently, has actually rather disrupted because of the end of child health surveillance checks. So it may be that those checks didn't do any good, and maybe the wrong people didn't come to them, but at least it was a way of maintaining a relationship. What we did in Glasgow, again, a few years back, is we looked at the how likely it was. We introduced, with the support of Matt Ford, now in the NSPCC, and his colleagues in the west of Glasgow, we asked health visitors to do a pilot contact at 13 months. And we asked them at that pilot contact to do a short questionnaire for the main carer of the child, looking at mental health. So it's a simple screening tool for anxiety and depression and irritability. It's very, very easy to do. And what we did was we looked at that set of information, and then we looked at whether the health visitors said that they would be likely to go back to visit that child again. And what we have is a slightly complicated graph, but the green families are the families in what's called the intensive group. So these are the children who are identified at high risk. And in those families, their likelihood, the health visitor is likely to go back to those families, whatever. Okay? The yellow ones are the ones in a kind of intermediate group, and the purple ones are in what's called the core group. Now, when Hall 4 was implemented in Scotland, if your health visitor rated you at low risk when the child was 6 weeks old, you didn't get any more health visiting. That was what we did. And so these families in the core group, when the health visitors went back and did this depression score, what they showed is that the higher the depression score, the more likely the health visitor was to say they would go back. Okay? So it's a structured instrument, it's very simple, but using a structured instrument like that is actually rather a good way of deciding on an equitable basis who it is that's most likely to benefit from our time. So my final slide, those of you who know me will know that over the last few years I've said some rather rude things about Scottish Government policy in relation to health visiting. I'm now Scottish Government's biggest fan. And actually there's a good reason for that, because in fact the changes that have been brought about in health visiting are absolutely revolutionary. We have gone back to something, or we are heading back towards something which is actually much better than the pre-2005 situation. And the pre-2005 situation was much better than the situation between 2005 and now, it has to be said. But this is the latest, this is the proposal from Scottish Government for the way that health visiting is going to work from now on. And I think this is a genuine cause for celebration, champagne. It's fantastic. The health visitor will introduce themselves to the family during pregnancy. There will be a handover as at present from the midwife to the health visitor around about 10 days with a new birth visit. There'll be 2 visits between 3 to 5 weeks. There'll be a health visitor assessment of the child and parent, 6 to 8 weeks, another visit at 12 weeks, another visit at 4 months, confirmation of health plan indicator status, that's whether the child's in the core group or the extra needs group, a visit at 8 months to the home, family child health review, still to be decided what the content of that to be at 13 to 15 months, another one at 27 to 30 months, and then an integrated child family health review with a handover to the school at 5 years. Now that is fantastic, I think. That's a way of, and the big commitment is that the health visitor will be the same health visitor. So families are even going to know who the health visitor is now, which is something that actually hasn't been happening for rather a long time. So there's been a transformation, and I think that this new core programme is going to give us the potential to identify need and to deliver support proportionately. At the moment, it's just a commitment, and the health visitors are being recruited, but I just get a very strong feeling that things are moving for the first time in a very good direction. So I'm going to stop there on that cheerful note.